The garden gate creaked, and Ophelia Wren froze with her hand still on the cold iron latch, certain someone had followed her into the darkness. She had left the ballroom only minutes ago, slipping past the crowd of silk gowns and polished boots without a single person noticing her absence. That was how it always was. 7 years of being called mad had taught her how to vanish in plain sight. Nobody watched the woman they whispered about. They only watched each other watch her. The moon hung low over the hedges of Ravenscourt house, throwing long shadows across the gravel path. Ophelia pressed a hand to her chest and listened. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the direction of the terrace. She should have run. Instead, she stood perfectly still, the way she always did when danger came near, as though stillness alone could make her disappear. "You are not supposed to be out here," a man's voice said from behind her. Ophelia turned sharply, her heart striking hard against her ribs. A tall figure stood a few feet away, his evening coat dark against the silver light, his face unreadable in the shadows. She did not recognize him, and in a house full of familiar faces, that alone unsettled her. "Neither are you," she answered, lifting her chin the way she had trained herself to do whenever fear threatened to show on her face. The man stepped closer, and moonlight finally caught his features. He was younger than she expected, with sharp eyes that studied her without the cruelty she had grown used to. There was no pity in his gaze either, which surprised her even more. "I own this house," he said simply, "so I suppose I have more right to the garden than you do, Miss Wren," she said, before she could stop herself. "Lady Ophelia Wren." Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, she realized. He knew her name. Everyone in London knew her name, though few of them knew anything true about her. She braced herself for the familiar reaction, the polite retreat, the whispered excuse to return indoors. It did not come. "Julian Ashworth," he said instead, offering the smallest bow. "Duke of Ravenscourt. Forgive me. I only returned to England a fortnight ago. I am still learning who belongs to which name in this city." Ophelia blinked. The Duke of Ravenscourt. She had heard of him, of course, the way everyone had heard of him. The reclusive young duke who had spent years abroad managing distant estates instead of taking his place among London's eligible bachelors. She had not expected to meet him hiding in his own garden at midnight, and she certainly had not expected him to look at her the way he was looking at her now, as though she were simply a woman standing in the moonlight and nothing more. "You should go back inside, Your Grace," she said quietly, "before someone sees you speaking with me. It will do your reputation no favors." "Why not?" The question caught her off guard. Nobody asked her why not. They simply knew, the way one knows to step around a puddle in the road, without needing to be told the water is there. "Because they call me mad," she said, and the words came out steadier than she expected, though she had never spoken them aloud to a stranger before. "Because I do not attend every ball, and when I do, I disappear from them. Because I have refused every suitor my brother has paraded before me, and because 7 years ago something happened that nobody has ever properly explained to the rest of London, and so they have decided to explain it themselves." Julian did not step back. He did not laugh or soften his voice the way people did when they spoke to someone they believed was fragile. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying her the way a man studies a puzzle he suspects has been solved incorrectly by everyone before him. "And what happened 7 years ago?" he asked. "That is not a question you ask a stranger in a garden," Ophelia said, though something in her chest ached at how badly she wanted to answer him honestly. "Perhaps not," he agreed. "But you did not walk away when I asked it. That tells me something." She should have walked away then. She had perfected the art of walking away, of turning corners before conversations could deepen into questions she could not answer. But there was something in the quiet certainty of his voice, some absence of judgment she had not felt directed at her in longer than she could remember, and her feet remained rooted to the gravel path. "You should not believe everything you hear about me, Your Grace," she finally said. "I make it a habit not to believe anything I hear until I have seen it for myself," he replied. "It has served me well in business. I imagine it will serve me equally well in London society, where I am told gossip moves faster than any ship I have ever captained across the Atlantic." Despite herself, Ophelia felt the corner of her mouth lift, the beginning of a smile she had not allowed herself in the company of a stranger in years. She caught it quickly and smoothed her expression back into practiced composure, but not quickly enough. She saw him notice. "You smile as though it surprises you," Julian observed. "It does," she admitted. "I have not had many reasons to, lately." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, though it should have been. Somewhere behind them, faint music drifted from the ballroom, violins weaving through laughter and the clink of crystal glasses. Ophelia was aware, suddenly, of how far they had walked from the house, how alone they were beneath the dark canopy of elm trees, and how strange it was that she did not feel the urge to flee. "Lady Ophelia," Julian said, his voice lower now, more careful, "I have been in London only a short while, but I have already heard your name mentioned more than once tonight, always in tones meant to warn me away from you. I confess, the warnings only made me curious." "Curiosity is a dangerous thing to feel about me," she said. "Ask my brother. He will tell you it has ruined better men than you. Has it ruined you?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through her chest that she had spent years learning to suppress. Nobody had ever asked her that directly. They asked around her, about her, in front of her, as though she were a portrait to be discussed rather than a woman capable of answering for herself. "I do not know yet," she said honestly. "Ask me again in a few years." Julian studied her for a long moment, and Ophelia found she could not look away from him, though every instinct told her she should. There was something unsettling about being truly seen after 7 years of being carefully unseen, of moving through rooms like a shadow everyone had already decided the shape of. "I would like that," he said finally, "the chance to ask you again." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching voices broke through the quiet, laughter and footsteps drawing closer along the garden path. Ophelia's entire body went rigid. If she were found alone with the Duke, in the dark, at this hour, the rumors that already clung to her name would multiply overnight, and this time her brother would not simply be embarrassed, he would be furious. "You must go," she whispered urgently. "Please. If anyone sees us together like this." "Let them see," Julian said, though he must have read the genuine fear in her expression, because his tone gentled immediately. "But if you would rather I did not, I will return to the house first. I am, after all, meant to be greeting my guests." He offered her a small, respectful nod, the kind one might give an equal rather than a woman the entire city considered broken. Then he turned and walked back toward the terrace, his figure swallowed slowly by the lantern light spilling from the tall windows of Ravenscourt House. Ophelia remained in the shadow of the hedges a moment longer, her pulse still unsteady, her mind turning over every word he had spoken. She pressed her palm against the rough bark of the nearest tree, grounding herself the way she had learned to do whenever the world tilted unexpectedly beneath her feet. For 7 years nobody had asked her a single honest question. Tonight, a duke she had never met had asked her 3. She did not know what frightened her more, the fact that he had asked, or the fact that some small, long-buried part of her wanted desperately to answer. The voices grew louder, and Ophelia finally moved, slipping along the far edge of the garden toward a side entrance she had used a dozen times before to re-enter unnoticed. As she walked, she found herself glancing once toward the lit windows of the ballroom, searching for a tall figure among the crowd inside. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself that by tomorrow, the Duke of Ravenscourt would have heard enough whispered warnings to keep his distance, the way every other sensible man in London eventually did. But some quiet, foolish part of her hoped that he would not. Inside the house, her brother Cassius stood near the refreshment table, his eyes sweeping the room the way they always did, cataloging every face, every conversation, every possible threat to the fragile reputation he had spent 7 years constructing around her silence. When he spotted her slipping in through the side door, his jaw tightened. "Where have you been?" he asked quietly, though his tone carried the sharp edge it always did when he suspected she had strayed from the careful boundaries he had drawn around her life. "Walking," Ophelia said simply. The room was too warm. Cassius studied her face for a long moment, the way he always did when he sensed she was not telling him everything. She had grown skilled at hiding things from him over the years, out of necessity rather than desire, and tonight was no different. She smoothed her expression into practiced blankness and moved past him toward the safety of the crowd, her heart still racing with the memory of moonlight and unanswered questions. Across the room, near the terrace doors, Julian Ashworth watched her go, already certain of one thing. Whatever the truth was behind the rumors that followed Lady Ophelia Wren, it was nothing like the story London had chosen to tell. And he intended to find out what that truth really was. He had heard the whispers before he ever set foot inside Ravenscourt House that evening. A footman had murmured something about the Wren girl while taking his coat. A cousin had leaned close during dinner to warn him, in the kindest possible tone, that Lady Ophelia was best admired from a distance and never approached. Even his own mother, the Dowager Duchess, had mentioned the name in passing, calling her a sad case, a young woman the Tun had quietly agreed to pity rather than understand. Julian had learned long ago that when everyone agreed on a story this completely, it was usually because no one had bothered to question it. He had seen the same pattern before, in business dealings abroad, where a single loud voice could shape an entire room's opinion before the facts were ever properly examined. Reputations, he had come to believe, were often built less on truth than on convenience. Standing now at the edge of the ballroom, watching Lady Ophelia move carefully through the crowd, greeting no one, meeting no one's eyes for longer than a heartbeat, he found himself troubled by how practiced her invisibility seemed. It was not the awkwardness of someone unwell. It was the discipline of someone who had trained herself, out of necessity, to take up as little space as possible. He thought of her voice in the garden, steady even as she spoke of the very rumors that haunted her, and the small crack of surprise in her smile when he had not recoiled from her honesty. There had been nothing mad in her words. If anything, she had sounded like the most clear-headed person in the entire house. A weight settled in his chest, something between curiosity and quiet resolve. Whatever secret her brother and the rest of London had built around her name, Julian intended to uncover it, not out of idle interest, but because some instinct deep within him refused to accept the easy explanation everyone else seemed so willing to believe. He turned back toward his guests, offering practiced smiles and empty pleasantries, all the while keeping one corner of his attention fixed on the far side of the room, where Lady Ophelia Wren stood near a window, staring out at the very garden where they had spoken only minutes before. The invitation arrived 3 days later, and Ophelia knew before she even broke the seal that her quiet life was about to become considerably more complicated. Lady Beatrice Fenwick delivered the news herself, sweeping into the Wren townhouse with her usual disregard for formality, waving a cream envelope like a banner of war. "The Duke of Ravenscourt has requested your presence at his mother's garden luncheon," she announced, dropping into the chair across from Ophelia without waiting to be invited to sit. "Specifically yours, Ophelia. Not the general invitation sent to half of London. Yours." Ophelia set down her needlework, her fingers suddenly unsteady. "That is not possible. He does not know me. He met you at his own ball, apparently, though you failed to mention this to me," Beatrice said, raising an eyebrow with the practiced skill of a woman who had spent years extracting secrets from people far more guarded than her closest friend. Half the room is already whispering about it. Something about the Duke abandoning his own guests to walk in the garden. Heat rose in Ophelia's cheeks. She had told no one about the conversation with Julian Ashworth, had barely allowed herself to think of it in the days since, afraid that examining the memory too closely would somehow make it less real, or worse, make it mean more than it should. "We spoke for a few minutes," Ophelia admitted carefully. "Nothing improper occurred." "I did not say it was improper," Beatrice said, leaning forward with obvious delight. "I said it was interesting. Do you know how many men in this city have gone out of their way to speak with you in the last 7 years? I can count them on one hand, and most of those conversations involved someone offering unsolicited prayers for your soul." Despite herself, Ophelia laughed, a short surprised sound that felt foreign in her own throat. Beatrice had always possessed the singular ability to make her laugh even in the darkest moments, a gift Ophelia had relied on more than she cared to admit since the fire that had changed everything 7 years ago. "Cassius will never allow it," Ophelia said, sobering quickly. "You know how he is about invitations that draw attention. He barely tolerates my presence at events he cannot avoid. Your brother," Beatrice said dryly, "does not control every letter that arrives at this house, though I imagine he wishes he did." As if summoned by the very mention of his name, Cassius appeared in the doorway of the sitting room, his expression already tightening with suspicion. Ophelia had learned to read every shift in her brother's face over the years. The way his jaw set when he sensed trouble, the way his eyes narrowed when he suspected she was keeping something from him. He wore that expression now. "What invitation?" he asked, his voice carrying the particular sharpness reserved only for matters concerning his sister's reputation. Beatrice, unbothered by his tone in the way only a lifelong friend of the family could be, held up the cream envelope. "The Duchess of Ravenscourt has invited Ophelia to a private luncheon. Quite an honor, considering the Dowager Duchess rarely extends personal invitations to anyone outside her closest circle." Cassius crossed the room and took the letter from Beatrice's outstretched hand, reading it twice before looking up at his sister with an expression Ophelia could not fully decipher. There was suspicion there, certainly, but also something calculating, as though he were already weighing the risks and benefits of allowing her to attend. "The Duke of Ravenscourt spoke to you at his own ball," Cassius said slowly. "It was not a question." "Briefly," Ophelia said, keeping her voice as even as possible. "In passing. You disappeared for nearly 20 minutes. Ophelia's stomach tightened. She had not realized anyone had marked the time, though she should have known better than to underestimate her brother's vigilance. Cassius had spent 7 years cataloging her every movement, every absence, every small deviation from the careful script he had written for her life. "I needed air," she said. The room was crowded. Cassius studied her a moment longer, then folded the letter and set it on the table between them, his expression shifting into something more thoughtful than she expected. "A connection to Ravenscourt would not be entirely unwelcome," he said finally, more to himself than to her. "The family holds considerable influence. If the Duke were to show you public favor, it could go some way toward quieting the rumors that have followed you." Ophelia felt something cold settle in her chest. Of course. Her brother was not considering her happiness, or even her safety. He was calculating advantage, the way he had calculated everything about her life since the night of the fire, weighing her worth in terms of what she could restore to the family name rather than what she might actually want. "I will attend," Ophelia said quietly, before Cassius could finish deciding for her. "But I will attend because I choose to, not because it serves some purpose of yours." Cassius's eyes flickered with something like surprise at her tone, though he said nothing further, simply nodding once before leaving the room with the letter still resting on the table. Beatrice waited until his footsteps had faded down the hall before speaking again, her voice dropping into something gentler than her usual teasing tone. "You know he only wants what is best for the family." "He wants what is best for the family name," Ophelia corrected. "Those have not been the same thing in a very long time." The garden luncheon, when it finally arrived 3 days later, proved far less daunting than Ophelia had feared. The Dowager Duchess, a sharp-eyed woman with silver hair and an even sharper tongue, greeted her with polite curiosity rather than the pity Ophelia had braced herself for. Julian appeared shortly after, offering her a small private smile across the crowded terrace that made her pulse quicken, in a way she immediately tried to suppress. They spoke only briefly during the luncheon itself, surrounded as they were by other guests, but Julian found a moment near the end of the afternoon to walk with her along the edge of the rose garden, away from the main gathering. "I half expected you would not come," he admitted, his hands clasped loosely behind his back as they walked. "I imagine your brother was not thrilled by the invitation." "He was calculating," Ophelia said honestly. "He always is." Julian glanced at her, something thoughtful crossing his features. "You speak of him carefully, as though every word must be measured before it leaves your mouth." "I have had a great deal of practice," she said. 7 years of it, in fact. They walked in silence for a moment, the scent of roses thick in the warm afternoon air. Ophelia found herself studying the careful lines of his profile, wondering what it would be like to speak to someone without measuring every word first, without calculating how each sentence might be repeated, twisted, used against her later. "May I ask you something?" Julian said finally, stopping beside a low stone bench beneath a flowering trellis. "And you may refuse to answer, if you wish." Ophelia's heart tightened, bracing herself for the question everyone eventually asked, the one about the fire, about her sister, about the 7 years of silence that had followed. But when Julian spoke, his question surprised her entirely. "What do you actually enjoy?" he asked. "Not what you are expected to enjoy, not what makes for polite conversation. What genuinely brings you happiness." The question caught her so completely off guard that for a moment she simply stared at him, searching for the trick hidden somewhere within it. But his expression held only patient curiosity, the same quiet attentiveness she had noticed in the garden days before. "I like to read," she said slowly, testing the honesty of the words as she spoke them. "Novels, mostly. Stories where the ending is not already decided by everyone else before the story even begins." Something in Julian's expression softened. "That sounds like a fairly specific complaint about more than just novels." Ophelia let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Perhaps it is." They sat together on the stone bench, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Ophelia found herself speaking freely, telling him about the books she loved, the quiet hours she spent in her late mother's library, the small rebellions she allowed herself within the narrow boundaries of her carefully managed life. Julian listened without interrupting, without judgment, asking questions that revealed genuine interest rather than polite obligation. It was Beatrice who eventually found them, appearing at the edge of the rose garden with an expression that suggested she had been searching for some time. "Your brother is asking for you," she said, though her eyes moved knowingly between Ophelia and the Duke. "It seems the luncheon is drawing to a close." Julian rose first, offering Ophelia his hand to help her from the bench, a small gesture that nonetheless sent warmth spreading through her chest. "Thank you for indulging my questions, Lady Ophelia," he said. "I find I have very few honest conversations in this city." Neither do I, she admitted. As she walked back toward the main terrace with Beatrice, Ophelia could feel Julian's eyes following her, though she resisted the urge to look back. Beatrice waited until they were well out of earshot before speaking. "You look different," she said quietly. "I do not know what you mean." "You look like someone who has just remembered what it feels like to be seen," Beatrice said, her teasing tone giving way to something more sincere. "Be careful, Ophelia. That kind of feeling is dangerous when you have spent 7 years learning to live without it." Ophelia said nothing, though she knew her friend was right. Somewhere across town, in a townhouse he rarely left except to attend the events his position required, a man named Edgar Croft had already heard whispers of the Duke's growing interest in Lady Ophelia Wren, and he was beginning, quietly and methodically, to calculate exactly how that interest might be turned to his own considerable advantage. Edgar Croft was not a wealthy man, though he wore his coats well enough to convince most of London otherwise. His fortune had dwindled steadily over the past several years, spent on debts he preferred not to discuss, and investments that had failed to yield the returns he promised his creditors. What remained of his prospects rested almost entirely on marriage, and he had long ago settled on Lady Ophelia Wren as his most promising target, not out of affection, but out of pure calculation. Her dowry was considerable, a fact that had not diminished despite the rumors surrounding her name. More importantly, her reputation made her vulnerable in a way few other eligible women in London were. A woman already whispered about, already isolated by gossip, made for an easier conquest than one surrounded by protective family and eager suitors. Croft had approached Cassius Wren twice in the past year with careful, indirect suggestions of marriage, and though Cassius had not outright refused him, he had not encouraged the match either, leaving the door open just enough to keep Croft circling. Now, hearing whispers that the Duke of Ravenscourt himself had taken a personal interest in Ophelia, Croft felt a familiar tightening of urgency in his chest. A duke's attention changed everything. If Julian Ashworth pursued Ophelia seriously, her value would rise considerably in the eyes of London society, and any lingering rumors about her past might quietly fade beneath the weight of a ducal courtship. That would place her entirely out of Croft's reach, and with her, the fortune he desperately needed. He would need to act carefully, and soon. Perhaps it was time to remind Cassius Wren of exactly what remained buried in his family's past, and how easily certain truths might resurface if the right story were told to the right people at the right moment. Back at the Wren townhouse that evening, Ophelia sat alone in her late mother's library, a book open on her lap though she had read the same page 3 times without absorbing a single word. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the rose garden, to Julian's quiet question, to the strange lightness she had felt while speaking honestly with someone for the first time in years. She knew better than to trust the feeling. Hope had betrayed her before, in ways that still ached when she allowed herself to remember them fully. 7 years ago, she had believed her family would stand beside her no matter what happened, had believed that truth mattered more than appearance, that love was sturdier than fear. She had learned, in the aftermath of the fire, exactly how wrong she had been. A soft knock at the library door interrupted her thoughts. Cassius entered without waiting for an answer, a habit she had long since stopped protesting. "The Duchess seemed pleased with you today," he said, settling into the chair across from her with an expression she could not quite read. "That is good. It reflects well on the family." "I am glad my presence was useful," Ophelia said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Cassius studied her for a long moment, and for once, something almost like uncertainty crossed his features. "I know you believe I think only of appearances," he said quietly. "But you must understand, Ophelia, after everything that happened, appearances were all I had left to protect. If the truth had come out, it would have destroyed us both," Ophelia finished for him, the familiar weight of the old argument settling heavily between them. "I know, Cassius, you have told me 100 times, and yet you resent me for it still." "I resent that I have spent 7 years paying for a truth I did not create," she said, her voice trembling slightly, despite her effort to keep it steady. "That is different from resenting the silence itself." Cassius said nothing for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some point beyond her shoulder, lost in memories she suspected haunted him just as deeply as they haunted her, though he rarely allowed himself to show it. Finally, he rose from the chair, pausing at the door before he left. "Be careful with the Duke," he said quietly. "Not because I doubt his intentions, but because I doubt our ability to survive further scrutiny, should anyone begin looking too closely into our past." Long after he had gone, Ophelia remained in the library, the unread book still resting forgotten in her lap, Cassius's warning echoing uncomfortably in the quiet room. The rain began just as Ophelia reached the entrance of the lending library, forcing her to duck beneath the stone archway alongside a dozen other Londoners caught unprepared by the sudden storm. She had come alone, a small act of defiance she allowed herself once a week, slipping away from the townhouse under the pretense of visiting Beatrice while actually spending an hour among the quiet shelves of books, the one place in the city where nobody whispered her name. She did not expect to see Julian there. He stood near the far window, a book open in his hands, though his attention seemed to drift toward the rain-streaked glass more than the pages before him. When he noticed her standing beneath the archway, damp and slightly breathless, something in his expression shifted into open pleasure, quickly smoothed into polite composure. "Lady Ophelia," he said, crossing the room toward her, "I did not expect to find you here." "I could say the same of you," she replied, shaking a few stray raindrops from her sleeve. "I did not take you for a man who spent his afternoons among dusty books." "I spent a great deal of time reading, when I lived abroad," Julian admitted. "There was little else to occupy the long evenings, once the day's business was concluded. I find I have not lost the habit, despite London's many distractions." They found themselves seated near the window a short while later, the rain providing a convenient excuse to linger longer than either of them likely intended. Julian had chosen a worn volume of poetry, and Ophelia found herself surprised by his easy familiarity with verses she had assumed few men bothered to read seriously. "You are full of surprises, Your Grace," she said, watching him turn a page with careful attention. "First an interest in gardens at midnight, now poetry on rainy afternoons. I begin to wonder what other secrets you are hiding." "Not so many secrets as you might think," Julian said, though something flickered briefly across his face that suggested otherwise. "Though I confess, I have grown rather tired of being the subject of speculation myself, these past 2 weeks. It seems half of London has developed sudden and passionate opinions about my intentions. Welcome to my life," Ophelia said dryly, though in my case, the speculation has lasted rather longer than 2 weeks. Julian set the book of poetry aside, turning to face her more fully, his expression growing serious in a way that made her pulse quicken with something between anticipation and apprehension. "May I ask you something, Ophelia? And this time, I would like an honest answer, whatever the cost of giving it." She should have deflected, the way she always did when conversations edged too close to the truth she had spent 7 years protecting. But something about the quiet sincerity in his voice, the absence of judgment in his gaze, made her want, for once, to answer honestly. "You may ask," she said carefully. "I cannot promise I will answer." "Fair enough." Julian leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping low enough that only she could hear it over the steady patter of rain against the window. "What actually happened 7 years ago? Not the version London tells, the truth." The question hung between them, heavier than she had expected, though she had known it was coming from the moment they first spoke in the garden. Her instinct screamed at her to deflect, to offer some vague, practiced answer that revealed nothing, the way she had done 100 times before with 100 other people who had asked in far less kind ways. But Julian was not asking out of idle curiosity, or cruel fascination with a scandal that had entertained London's drawing rooms for years. He was asking because he genuinely wanted to understand her, and something in Ophelia's chest ached with the sheer novelty of being seen that way. "There was a fire," she said quietly, her hands twisting together in her lap. "At our family's country estate, 7 years ago, I had a younger sister, Margaret. She was 17, kind, restless, always chafing against the restrictions our father placed on her. She wanted a life beyond what our family expected of her, a life she was never permitted to have." Julian remained silent, giving her space to continue at her own pace, his full attention fixed entirely on her. "The night of the fire, Margaret had been meeting someone in secret, a young man our father considered entirely unsuitable. I knew about it. I had known for months and said nothing, because she begged me to keep her confidence, and because some part of me admired her courage in wanting something for herself, even if it meant deceiving our family." Ophelia's voice trembled slightly, though she pressed forward, determined now to finish what she had started. "That night, there was a candle left burning in the old servants' passage where they used to meet. Nobody knows exactly how it started, whether the candle tipped or the drapery caught too close to the flame. By the time anyone noticed the smoke, the passage was already engulfed." "Margaret," Julian said quietly, understanding dawning in his expression. "She did not survive," Ophelia said, the old grief rising sharp and immediate despite 7 years of practice at containing it. "Neither did the young man she had been meeting. And when my father demanded to know how the fire started, how his youngest daughter had come to be in that passage in the middle of the night, I told him the truth. I told him I had known about her secret meetings and said nothing. That was not your fault, Julian said, his voice firm. My father did not see it that way, Ophelia continued. Neither did Cassius. Not truly, though he expressed it differently. My father could not bear the shame of what had happened. Could not bear London knowing his daughter had died in scandal, rather than in some more respectable tragedy. So he decided, before he himself passed less than a year later from grief and illness combined, that the story London would hear was different entirely. He said I had gone into the passage that night in a fit of some nervous distress, that I had knocked the candle myself, that Margaret had died trying to save me from the flames I had caused. Julian's expression darkened with quiet fury on her behalf. He blamed you, publicly. He protected Margaret's memory, Ophelia corrected, though her voice carried no real conviction behind the words, only the exhausted repetition of an argument she had rehearsed with herself 1,000 times. And in doing so, he made me into the villain of the story, instead of allowing the truth to tarnish either of our names. A grieving, unstable sister was easier for London to accept than a scandal involving secret meetings and forbidden lovers. Cassius has maintained the story ever since, insisting it protects what remains of the family's reputation. And you have carried this for 7 years, Julian said quietly. Alone. I made a promise to my father before he died, Ophelia said, that I would never correct the story, no matter what it cost me. He believed, perhaps rightly, that the truth would destroy what little remained of our family's standing. Margaret's reputation, ruined by a scandal of forbidden love. Our father's judgment, questioned by all of London. So instead, I became mad, isolated, a cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties. It was easier for everyone, except for me. The rain continued outside, steady and rhythmic, filling the silence that stretched between them as Julian absorbed everything she had told him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet intensity that made her chest tighten with something dangerously close to hope. That is not madness, he said. That is the single most selfless thing I have ever heard. You sacrificed 7 years of your own life and reputation to honor a promise to a dying father and protect the memory of a sister you loved. It does not feel selfless, Ophelia admitted. Most days it simply feels like drowning. Julian reached across the small distance between them, his hand hovering briefly before settling gently over hers, a gesture so unexpected that Ophelia's breath caught in her throat. You are the least mad person I have ever met, Ophelia Wren. I only wish the rest of London could see what I see. They cannot, she said softly, not without destroying Margaret's memory and dishonoring the promise I made my father. Then perhaps, Julian said carefully, there is another way. A way to reveal enough truth to clear your name, without unraveling every thread your father tried so desperately to protect. Ophelia looked up at him, startled by the possibility she had never allowed herself to consider in 7 long years of silence. Do you truly believe that is possible? I do not know yet, Julian admitted honestly, but I intend to find out, if you will allow me to help you. Before she could answer, the library door opened, and a familiar figure stepped inside, shaking rain from his coat. Edgar Croft's eyes swept the room and landed immediately on the two of them seated close together near the window, hands still touching, expressions still open with a vulnerability neither had quite managed to hide in time. A slow, calculating smile spread across Croft's face as he approached. Lady Ophelia, he said smoothly, offering a shallow bow. And your grace, what an unexpected pleasure, finding you both here, in such intimate conversation. Ophelia withdrew her hand quickly, though she knew the damage of the moment had already been done. Croft's eyes lingered a beat too long on the space between them, calculating, filing away information he would undoubtedly put to use at the first convenient opportunity. Mr. Croft, Julian said, his tone cooling considerably as he rose to his feet. We were merely discussing literature. Of course, Croft said, his smile widening in a way that made Ophelia's stomach twist with unease. Though I imagine your discussion will provide excellent material for conversation at tonight's card party. Half of London will be eager to hear what brought the Duke of Ravenscourt and Lady Ophelia together in such close quarters on a rainy afternoon. There is nothing improper to report, Julian said firmly. Naturally not, Croft agreed, though his tone suggested he intended to imply otherwise regardless of the truth. He turned his attention fully toward Ophelia, his expression shifting into something falsely gentle. I do hope you are well, Lady Ophelia. It has been some time since we last spoke. Perhaps you might allow me to call on you this week. I would so enjoy renewing our acquaintance. I am rather occupied this week, Mr. Croft, Ophelia said carefully, though she could feel the familiar tightness of anxiety coiling in her chest. A pity, Croft said, though his eyes told a different story entirely, one that promised he would not be so easily discouraged. Well, I shall not intrude further on your literary discussion. Good afternoon to you both. He left as smoothly as he had arrived, though the atmosphere in the library felt considerably changed by his brief presence. Julian watched him go with a guarded expression, his earlier warmth tempered now by obvious concern. "Who is that man to you?" he asked quietly, once Croft had disappeared through the entrance doors. "A suitor my brother has never quite discouraged," Ophelia said, unable to fully mask the unease in her voice. "Though I have refused him twice already, he does not seem inclined to accept refusal as final." "I do not like the way he looked at you," Julian said, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger. "Neither do I," Ophelia admitted. "But I fear today's conversation, however innocent, has given him precisely the kind of information he enjoys collecting." Outside, the rain finally began to ease, though the unease settling in Ophelia's chest showed no sign of following the storm's example. Julian offered to escort her home, and though Ophelia knew it would draw further attention if anyone recognized his carriage outside the Wren townhouse, she found herself accepting anyway, unwilling to end their conversation so abruptly after everything she had finally allowed herself to say aloud. They rode in comfortable silence for much of the journey, the city passing slowly by beyond rain-streaked windows, the earlier tension from Croft's appearance gradually giving way to something quieter between them. "Thank you," Ophelia said finally as the carriage drew near her street, "for listening. Truly listening, I mean. Not simply waiting for your turn to offer judgment, the way most people do." "I would not know how to judge you for surviving something so difficult," Julian said. "If anything, I find myself in awe of how you have carried it all this time, without breaking beneath the weight of it." "Some days I am not certain I have not broken," she admitted quietly. "I have simply become skilled at hiding the cracks." Julian studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps it is time someone helped you carry the weight, instead of watching you carry it alone." Ophelia did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing, though the words settled somewhere deep in her chest, warm and unfamiliar, and slightly frightening in their implications. When the carriage finally stopped outside her home, Julian helped her down himself, his hands steady beneath hers, lingering perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary before he stepped back. "I meant what I said in the library," he told her quietly, "about finding a way to help you. I do not make promises lightly, Ophelia, and I do not intend to abandon this one. Be careful," she warned him gently. "My family's secrets have a way of punishing those who go looking for them." "I have never been particularly good at being careful," Julian admitted, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Ask my mother. She will tell you it is one of my more troublesome qualities." Ophelia found herself smiling in return, despite the lingering unease Croft's appearance had left behind. She watched Julian's carriage pull away from the curb before finally turning toward her own front door, her thoughts a tangled mixture of hope and apprehension that she had not felt in longer than she could remember. Inside, the house was quiet, Cassius apparently still occupied with business at his club, and Ophelia retreated to her room, grateful for the solitude to sit with everything that had happened that afternoon. She had told someone the truth, finally, after 7 years of careful silence, and the world had not ended because of it. If anything, she felt lighter than she had in years, as though some small portion of the weight she carried had finally been shared with another set of shoulders willing to bear it alongside her. But beneath the lightness lingered a persistent thread of fear. Edgar Croft had seen them together, had witnessed a vulnerability she rarely allowed anyone to glimpse, and men like Croft did not forget such opportunities easily. She thought of his calculating smile, the falsely gentle way he had spoken of renewing their acquaintance, and something cold settled in her stomach despite the warmth that lingered from her conversation with Julian. She did not yet know how right she was to worry. Across town, in a dim study lit by a single lamp, Edgar Croft sat with a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow, turning over the afternoon's discovery in his mind with the careful precision of a man accustomed to finding advantage in other people's vulnerabilities. The Duke's interest in Lady Ophelia was clearly no passing curiosity. Whatever conversation he had witnessed in that library had been intimate, serious, the kind of exchange that suggested genuine attachment rather than idle flirtation. That changed things considerably. If Ravenscourt intended to pursue Ophelia in earnest, Croft's window of opportunity was rapidly closing. He would need to move quickly, and he would need leverage, something powerful enough to force Cassius Wren's hand before the Duke's courtship progressed any further. Croft had heard whispers over the years, fragments of rumor about the fire at the Wren estate that never quite matched the official story London had accepted without question. He had never possessed enough information to be certain, but perhaps it was time to make some careful inquiries of his own. A family desperate enough to maintain a 7-year lie was a family with something worth protecting, and Croft had built his entire fortune, meager as it currently was, on the simple principle that desperate people made for easy leverage. He finally reached for the brandy glass, a slow smile spreading across his face, as the beginnings of a plan took shape in his mind. Lady Ophelia Wren would marry him yet, whether she chose to or not. Cassius found the letter waiting on his desk 3 days after the incident at the lending library, sealed with wax that bore no crest, no identifying mark of any kind, which alone was enough to make his stomach tighten with unease before he had even broken the seal. The message inside was brief, precise, and utterly devastating. I know what truly happened the night of the fire at your family's estate. I know about Margaret's secret meetings, and I know your father's story was a fabrication designed to protect her memory at your sister's expense. I have no wish to make this knowledge public, provided we can reach a suitable arrangement regarding Lady Ophelia's hand in marriage. You have 1 week to consider my proposal favorably. E.C. Cassius read the letter 3 times before setting it down with hands that trembled slightly, a reaction he immediately despised himself for. 7 years of careful vigilance, 7 years of maintaining the story his father had constructed on his deathbed, and now it hung by a single thread held by a man he had never fully trusted. He had suspected, of course, that Edgar Croft possessed some knowledge beyond the official story. There had been comments over the years, subtle implications dropped into conversation with just enough ambiguity to suggest more knowledge than proof. Cassius had dismissed them as idle fishing, the kind of vague insinuation a desperate man might employ to secure advantage without any actual evidence to support his claims. This letter was different. This letter spoke with a certainty that suggested Croft possessed something concrete, some piece of evidence or testimony that transformed suspicion into genuine threat. Cassius sat alone in his study for a long while, the letter resting on the desk before him, his mind turning over the impossible choice Croft had presented. If he refused, if he called Croft's bluff and the man made good on his threat, the truth would spread through London within days, destroying not only Ophelia's already fragile reputation, but unraveling everything their father had sacrificed his final months to protect. Margaret's memory would be tainted by scandal. Their family name would become synonymous, not with tragedy nobly borne, but with deception exposed. If he accepted, if he forced Ophelia into marriage with a man who had built his entire courtship on threat rather than affection, he would be condemning his sister to a lifetime, with someone fundamentally cruel, someone who had already demonstrated his willingness to exploit her deepest pain for personal gain. Neither option felt survivable. He thought of his sister as she had been before the fire, bright and curious in her own quieter way, always trailing after Margaret's more visible rebellions with a steadiness that had somehow made their father trust her more, burden her more, ultimately sacrifice her more than either of his other children. He thought of the promise he had made his father in those final fading weeks, a promise to protect what remained of the family's honor at any cost. He had never considered, until this moment, exactly how high that cost might eventually become. That evening, Cassius requested a private audience with Ophelia in the small parlor at the back of the house, away from the servants who might overhear. She arrived looking wary, the way she always did when he called for her directly rather than encountering her in the natural course of the day, and he realized with a fresh pang of guilt exactly how thoroughly his own behavior over the years had taught her to fear such summons. "I received a letter today," Cassius began, his voice rougher than he intended, "from Edgar Croft." He watched the color drain from Ophelia's face as he explained the contents, watched her hands twist together in her lap the way they always did when fear threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. When he finished, silence stretched between them, heavy with 7 years of unspoken grief and guilt neither had ever fully addressed. "He knows," Ophelia said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "about Margaret." "He claims to know," Cassius corrected, though even as he said it, he recognized the desperate hope in his own denial. "We do not know how much proof he actually possesses, or whether this is simply an elaborate attempt to manipulate us into believing he has more leverage than he truly does." "Does it matter?" Ophelia asked, lifting her eyes to meet his directly, something fierce and exhausted burning in their depths. "Whether he possesses proof or merely believes he can convince others of the truth, the outcome remains the same, does it not? Either I marry him to buy his silence, or the story we have protected for 7 years collapses regardless." Cassius had no answer for that, because she was right, and they both knew it. "I will not force you into marriage with that man," Cassius said quietly, surprising himself with the sudden certainty in his own voice. Whatever else I have done these past 7 years, whatever silence I have asked you to carry, I will not add this to the burden." Ophelia's eyes widened slightly, clearly startled by the unexpected firmness of his declaration. "You would risk the family's ruin, rather than see me married to Croft?" "I have spent 7 years protecting a version of our family's reputation that has cost you nearly everything," Cassius said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to express. "I told myself it was necessary, that Father's dying wish demanded it, that the alternative was somehow worse. But watching you these past weeks, watching you find something like happiness with the Duke for the first time since Margaret died, I have begun to wonder whether the alternative was truly worse at all, or whether I simply convinced myself it was, because the lie was easier to maintain than confronting the truth of what we lost that night." Tears gathered in Ophelia's eyes, though she blinked them back with the same stubborn control she had exercised for 7 long years. "What do we do then?" "I do not yet know," Cassius admitted. "But I do not intend to let Edgar Croft dictate the terms of your future through threat and manipulation. We have 1 week before his deadline. I intend to use it wisely." The following afternoon, Ophelia found herself once again in the gardens of Ravenscourt House, though this time the visit carried none of the lightness of their previous meetings. She had sent word to Julian requesting to speak with him privately, and he had responded immediately, meeting her at the garden gate with an expression that shifted quickly from pleased anticipation to genuine concern as he took in her troubled expression. "What has happened?" he asked, guiding her toward a secluded bench beneath the same elm trees where they had first spoken weeks earlier. Ophelia told him everything: the letter, Croft's threat, her brother's unexpected declaration the previous evening. Julian listened with growing anger evident in the tightness of his jaw, his hands clenched at his sides as though physically restraining himself from some more immediate reaction. "He would use your sister's death, your family's grief, as leverage for marriage," Julian said, his voice low with barely controlled fury. "That is beneath contempt. It is also, unfortunately, quite effective," Ophelia said wearily. "Whatever proof he claims to possess, the threat alone is enough to destroy everything my family has protected for 7 years." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some distant point across the garden, clearly turning something over carefully in his mind. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a determination that sent a fresh wave of hope, however fragile, through Ophelia's chest. "What if the truth were not something to fear, but something to control?" he asked. "What if, instead of allowing Croft to force your hand through threat, you told the truth on your own terms, before he ever had the chance?" Ophelia stared at him, startled by the suggestion. "You are asking me to break a promise I made my dying father." "I am asking you to consider whether that promise has served anyone well these past 7 years, besides Croft's ability to manipulate you with it now," Julian said gently. "Your father wanted to protect Margaret's memory, and your family's honor. But look at what protecting that lie has actually cost. 7 years of your life spent isolated, branded mad, denied any chance at genuine happiness, and now, the very secret meant to protect your family has become the weapon threatening to destroy it entirely." "If I tell the truth," Ophelia said slowly, working through the implications even as she spoke them aloud, "Croft loses his leverage. There would be nothing left for him to threaten us with." "Precisely," Julian said, "and you would finally be free of a lie that has cost you everything, told on your own terms, rather than forced from you by a man with no genuine claim to your family's story." "But Margaret," Ophelia said, old grief rising sharp in her chest, "her memory, if the truth about her secret meetings comes out." "Margaret was a young woman who wanted love and freedom," Julian said firmly. "That is not scandal, Ophelia, whatever your father believed. That is simply the truth of a life cut tragically short. I do not believe revealing that truth dishonors her memory. If anything, I believe continuing to hide it, continuing to let her be remembered only through a lie that punishes her sister, dishonors her far more." Ophelia sat with his words for a long moment, feeling something shift within her chest, some old, calcified certainty beginning to crack beneath the weight of a possibility she had never allowed herself to fully consider. Perhaps the truth, however painful, was not the destruction her father had feared. Perhaps it was, instead, the only path toward the freedom she had quietly craved for 7 long years. "If I do this," she said finally, "if I tell the truth, there is no undoing it afterward. London will know everything. Margaret's meetings, my silence, my father's fabrication. There will be no controlling how the story is received. There is also no controlling how it continues to be used against you, so long as it remains a secret held by someone willing to weaponize it," Julian said. I cannot make this decision for you, Ophelia, but whatever you choose, I intend to stand beside you through it. Ophelia looked at him for a long moment, searching his expression for any trace of hesitation, any sign that his commitment might waver once the full weight of scandal descended upon them both. She found none. Only steady, unwavering resolve, the same quiet certainty she had noticed the very first night they met in this same garden. Then perhaps, she said slowly, it is time London finally heard the truth. Julian reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his own, a gesture of quiet solidarity rather than romantic pretense, though Ophelia felt the warmth of it settle deep into her chest regardless. You will not face this alone, he said. Whatever happens once the truth is known, I intend to remain beside you through every part of it. You barely know me, Ophelia said softly, though there was no accusation in the words, only genuine wonder at the strength of his conviction. We have spoken perhaps 4 times, and already you are prepared to stand against London's judgment on my behalf. I have known enough people who hide behind careful masks to recognize genuine character when I finally see it unguarded, Julian said. You have spent 7 years protecting everyone around you, at tremendous cost to yourself. That is not the behavior of someone unstable or mad, Ophelia. That is the behavior of someone remarkably strong, forced by circumstance to carry burdens no one else was willing to share. They sat together beneath the elm trees as the afternoon light softened toward evening, discussing carefully how the truth might best be revealed, weighing the risks of a private confession to select members of society against the more dramatic possibility of a public declaration that would leave no room for Croft to twist the story further in his favor. Julian suggested involving his mother, the Dowager Duchess, whose opinion carried considerable weight within London's most influential circles, and whose growing fondness for Ophelia might lend crucial credibility to whatever account eventually emerged. She has taken quite a liking to you, Julian said, a small smile touching his lips for the first time since Ophelia had arrived with her troubling news, which is rather remarkable, given how difficult she typically finds most people. I am glad to have earned her approval, Ophelia said, though I fear that approval may be tested considerably once the full truth becomes known. My mother has weathered worse storms than gossip, Julian said. I suspect she will surprise you. As the sun began its slow descent behind the garden walls, Ophelia found herself reluctant to end their conversation, reluctant to return to the tense uncertainty waiting for her at home, where Cassius remained locked in his study, wrestling with decisions that would shape the remainder of both their lives. But duty called her back eventually, and Julian walked her to the garden gate himself, his hand resting briefly at the small of her back in a gesture that felt protective rather than presumptuous. 1 week, he reminded her gently. We have 1 week before Croft's deadline arrives. That is enough time to plan carefully, provided we do not waste it in hesitation. I trust you, Ophelia said, surprising herself with how easily the words came, how completely she meant them despite everything her 7 years of careful guardedness should have taught her about trusting anyone so quickly. I have not trusted anyone outside my own family in longer than I can remember. Then I intend to prove myself worthy of that trust, Julian said quietly, however long it takes. She left the garden with her heart considerably lighter than when she had arrived, though the weight of the decision ahead still pressed heavily against her chest. The truth, once spoken, could never be called back. Margaret's memory, her father's final wish, Cassius's carefully maintained reputation, all of it would shift irrevocably the moment she chose honesty over the silence she had maintained for 7 exhausting years. But for the first time since the fire had taken everything she once knew as certain, Ophelia found herself believing that perhaps the truth, however costly, might finally set her free from a prison she had not chosen to build, but had spent 7 years trapped within regardless. The card party at Lady Pemberton's townhouse had drawn nearly every notable family in London, the kind of glittering gathering Ophelia would once have avoided entirely, but which she now approached with a strange, steady calm settling over her nerves. She knew Croft would be present. He attended every event where he might find opportunity to corner her, to remind her, however subtly, of the deadline ticking steadily closer with each passing day. She had not expected him to strike so publicly, so soon. Ophelia had barely finished greeting her hostess when Croft appeared at her side, his smile pleasant enough to fool anyone who had not already glimpsed the calculation lurking beneath it. Lady Ophelia, he said smoothly, I do hope you have given careful thought to my letter. This is neither the time nor the place, Mr. Croft, Ophelia said, keeping her voice low, though she was acutely aware of several nearby guests glancing curiously in their direction. On the contrary, Croft said, his voice carrying just enough to draw further attention from the surrounding cluster of guests. I believe this is precisely the time. You see, I have grown rather tired of waiting patiently for your answer, and I find myself wondering whether London might benefit from hearing a certain story I have recently uncovered regarding the true circumstances of your sister's tragic death. The words landed like a struck blow, and Ophelia felt the blood drain from her face as several nearby conversations fell abruptly silent, guests turning with the particular hungry attention London reserved for the promise of fresh scandal. Across the room she caught sight of Julian moving quickly through the crowd toward her, his expression darkening as he registered the tableau unfolding. "You would not dare," Ophelia said, though her voice trembled slightly despite her best efforts to maintain composure. "Would I not?" Croft said, his smile widening into something considerably less pleasant. "I have waited a full week for your family's answer, Lady Ophelia. I believe I have been more than patient. Perhaps a public accounting of the truth would finally encourage the swift resolution I have been seeking." "That is quite enough, Croft," Julian said, arriving at Ophelia's side with a coldness in his voice she had not heard from him before, sharp and commanding in a way that immediately silenced the nearest onlookers. "Your Grace," Croft said, offering a shallow, mocking bow. "How fortunate you have arrived. Perhaps you would care to hear the story I am prepared to share with our gathered friends this evening, regarding the true nature of the fire that claimed young Margaret Wren's life 7 years ago." A murmur rippled through the nearby crowd, curiosity and anticipation building visibly among the guests who had gathered close enough to overhear the confrontation. Ophelia felt Cassius appear at her other side, his face pale but resolute, having apparently followed the commotion from across the room. "Croft," Cassius said, his voice low and dangerous, "you will regret whatever you say next." "I regret nothing," Croft said, though something flickered briefly across his expression, a hint of uncertainty quickly masked by renewed bravado. "I merely intend to share a truth your family has hidden for 7 years, unless, of course, Lady Ophelia reconsiders her refusal of my proposal before I finish speaking." The room had gone nearly silent now, every guest within earshot, straining to catch every word of the confrontation unfolding before them. Ophelia felt the familiar instinct to shrink, to disappear, the 7-year habit of invisibility screaming at her to retreat before the scandal could fully engulf her. But something else rose within her too, something steadier and far more determined, born from the conversation she had shared with Julian in the garden days before. She would not let Croft control this narrative, not anymore. "There is no need for threats, Mr. Croft," Ophelia said, her voice ringing out with a clarity that surprised even herself, cutting cleanly through the murmuring crowd. "I intend to tell the truth myself, on my own terms, and I have no need of your assistance in doing so." Croft's confident expression faltered, clearly having anticipated fear rather than the steady resolve now settling across Ophelia's features. Around them, the gathered guests leaned in closer, sensing that whatever unfolded next would become the talk of London for weeks to come. "7 years ago," Ophelia began, her voice steady despite the tremor she could feel building beneath her composed exterior, "my younger sister Margaret died in a fire at our family's country estate. For 7 years, London has believed that fire began because of some fit of nervous distress on my part, that Margaret died, attempting to save me from flames I myself caused." She paused, gathering herself, aware of every eye in the room now fixed upon her, aware of Julian standing steady and unwavering at her side, aware of Cassius's hand tightening briefly on her shoulder in silent support. "That story was a fabrication," Ophelia continued, "constructed by my father in the aftermath of unbearable grief, to protect my sister's memory from a truth he considered far more shameful than the lie he chose instead. Margaret had been meeting a young man in secret, someone my father considered entirely unsuitable. The fire began accidentally, during one of their meetings, and both Margaret and the young man perished before anyone could reach them in time." A collective gasp rippled through the surrounding crowd, though Ophelia forced herself to continue, unwilling now to stop before the truth had been fully spoken. "I knew about her secret meetings," she said. "I had known for months, and I said nothing, because she asked for my silence, and because I loved her too much to betray her trust, even knowing the risk it carried. When the fire took her life, my father could not bear for London to know his youngest daughter had died in scandal. So he told them instead that I had caused the fire, that I was unstable, unwell, deserving of pity rather than judgment. I made a promise to him, before he died less than a year later, that I would never correct the story. For 7 years I have kept that promise, at considerable cost to my own life and reputation." Her voice caught slightly, though she pressed forward, refusing to let the emotion overwhelm her before she finished. "I am not mad, and I was never responsible for my sister's death. I was simply a grieving daughter who honored a dying father's final wish, even when that wish cost me nearly everything else in my life. I share this truth now, not because Mr. Croft has forced my hand through threat, but because I have finally realized that continuing to hide behind a lie protects no one, least of all the memory of a sister I loved dearly, and who deserves to be remembered honestly, not as a footnote in a story designed to shame me instead. Silence held the room for a long, suspended moment before Julian stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed gathering. I have known Lady Ophelia only a short time, but I can say without hesitation that what she has just done, standing before all of you and speaking a difficult truth at considerable personal risk, is the furthest thing from madness I have ever witnessed. It is, instead, the single bravest act I have seen performed in any London drawing room. Croft's expression had shifted from confident calculation into something closer to panic, clearly recognizing that his leverage had evaporated entirely the moment Ophelia claimed the narrative as her own. "This changes nothing," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "The scandal remains, regardless of who tells the story first." "The scandal was never Lady Ophelia's to bear," Julian said firmly, turning to face Croft directly, his tone carrying an authority that made several nearby guests instinctively step back. "You sought to weaponize a family's private grief for your own financial gain, threatening a woman who had done nothing but protect her sister's memory at tremendous personal cost. I believe it is your behavior, Mr. Croft, that London should find truly scandalous." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, several guests turning openly disapproving expressions toward Croft, whose face had gone pale beneath the weight of sudden, unwelcome scrutiny. Whatever advantage he had believed he possessed only minutes earlier had dissolved entirely, replaced instead by the very public exposure he had threatened to inflict upon someone else. "I believe," Cassius said, stepping forward with quiet but unmistakable authority, "that you should leave, Mr. Croft, before I say something considerably less restrained than I currently intend." Croft glanced around the room, taking in the disapproving stares now fixed firmly upon him, and seemed to recognize, perhaps for the first time, exactly how thoroughly his plan had collapsed. Without another word, he turned and made his way quickly through the parting crowd toward the exit, his earlier confidence entirely abandoned. In the aftermath of his departure, the room remained quiet for a long moment, before Lady Pemberton herself approached, her expression carrying none of the judgment Ophelia had braced herself to receive. "My dear," she said gently, "I had no idea. None of us did. Thank you for trusting us with the truth." Other guests began approaching cautiously in the following minutes, some offering quiet words of sympathy, others simply nodding respectfully in Ophelia's direction, a stark and overwhelming contrast to 7 years of whispered judgment and careful avoidance. It was not universal acceptance, not immediately, but it was something Ophelia had not dared hope for in longer than she could remember. Genuine consideration rather than cruel speculation. Beatrice found her way to Ophelia's side amid the gradually shifting crowd, tears standing in her eyes as she embraced her friend tightly. "You were remarkable," she whispered, "truly remarkable." "I was terrified," Ophelia admitted, her own composure finally beginning to crack now that the immediate danger had passed. "Terrified people do not speak with the steadiness you just demonstrated," Beatrice said. "Whatever comes next, Ophelia, you have already won something far more important than Croft's silence tonight. You have reclaimed your own story." Julian remained close beside her throughout the remainder of the evening, a steady, quiet presence that Ophelia found herself grateful for, in ways she had not anticipated. As the party began winding toward its natural conclusion, he walked with her toward the entrance hall, away from the lingering attention of curious guests. "You were extraordinary tonight," he said quietly, once they had found a moment of relative privacy. "I have never witnessed such courage." "I could not have done it without knowing you stood beside me," Ophelia admitted. "That knowledge gave me strength I did not know I still possessed." Julian reached for her hand, holding it gently in the dim light of the entrance hall, his expression carrying a warmth that made her chest ache with something far more powerful than simple gratitude. "The truth is out now," he said. "Whatever London decides to make of it, you no longer carry that burden alone, and you never will again, if I have any say in the matter." Ophelia looked up at him, feeling something shift permanently within her chest, 7 years of careful isolation finally beginning to loosen their tight grip upon her heart. "I believe," she said softly, "that you have quite a considerable say in the matter, Your Grace." Outside, the London night had grown clear and cool, stars visible above the city for the first time in days, and Ophelia found herself, for the first time in 7 long years, looking toward the future with something dangerously close to genuine hope. The following morning brought a flood of callers to the Wren townhouse, far more than Ophelia had ever received in 7 years combined. Some came out of curiosity, eager to hear the story firsthand rather than through second-hand gossip. Others came with genuine sympathy, having lost siblings or family members themselves, and recognizing in Ophelia's grief something achingly familiar. A few, inevitably, came still clinging to judgment, unwilling to fully release 7 years of carefully cultivated assumptions about her character. But even their number felt smaller than Ophelia had expected, a quiet vindication she allowed herself to feel, without the guilt that had shadowed every small joy for so long. Cassius found her in the late afternoon, sitting alone in their mother's library, the same room where she had once received his warning about the dangers of trusting Julian too quickly. He entered slowly, his expression carrying none of the guarded control she had grown accustomed to over the years. "I owe you an apology," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Not simply for the burden I asked you to carry these 7 years, but for how readily I accepted Father's judgment of what needed protecting. I told myself I was honoring his memory. In truth, I was avoiding the harder work of questioning whether his decision was right at all." "You were grieving too," Ophelia said quietly. "We both lost people that night, Margaret, eventually Father as well. I do not think either of us handled that grief with much wisdom." "Perhaps not," Cassius admitted, "but you paid a far steeper price for our family's grief than I ever did. I kept my place in society. My reputation remained largely untouched, while yours was systematically dismantled to protect a story that was never true in the first place." "I do not say this to absolve you entirely," Ophelia said, "but I understand now, more than I did even a week ago, how frightened you were of losing everything Father left behind. Fear makes people choose the easier lie over the harder truth. I do not think you are the only one guilty of that particular failing." Cassius reached across the small space between them, taking her hand in a rare gesture of open affection. "Whatever comes next, whatever London decides to make of what you revealed last night, I intend to stand beside you properly this time, not as your keeper, the way I have behaved these past 7 years, but as your brother." Ophelia felt tears gather in her eyes, the first she had allowed herself to shed freely in longer than she could remember. "I would like that very much." Later that evening, the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscourt paid an unannounced visit to the Wren townhouse, arriving with a quiet dignity that immediately commanded the household's full attention. She requested a private audience with Ophelia, and, when they were finally alone in the sitting room, her sharp eyes studied Ophelia's face with an intensity that felt less like judgment and more like careful assessment. "My son tells me you displayed remarkable courage last night," the Duchess said. "I have heard several accounts already, each one more impressive than the last." "I simply told the truth, Your Grace," Ophelia said. "It felt less like courage and more like necessity." "The two are rarely as separate as people believe," the Duchess said, a faint smile touching her lips. "I lost a sister myself, many years ago, in circumstances my own family preferred not to discuss honestly. I understand, better than most in this city, exactly what it costs to carry a silence like the one you carried for 7 years. Ophelia looked up, startled by the unexpected vulnerability in the older woman's admission. "I am sorry for your loss, Your Grace." "As I am for yours," the Duchess said. "I will tell you plainly, since I have never been a woman inclined toward unnecessary subtlety. My son has spoken of you a great deal these past weeks, more than he has spoken of any woman since his return to England. I do not offer my approval lightly, Lady Ophelia, but I offer it to you now, freely and without reservation." The words settled warmly in Ophelia's chest, a quiet validation she had not realized she needed until it was finally given. As the Duchess rose to take her leave, she paused at the doorway, glancing back with an expression that carried both affection and quiet amusement. "Whatever my son decides to do next," she said, "I suspect it will not surprise either of us particularly." Ophelia remained in the sitting room long after the Duchess had departed, turning over the implications of her words, allowing herself, finally, to imagine a future she had spent 7 years believing was permanently beyond her reach. The invitation to the Ravenscourt summer ball arrived a full month after the confrontation at Lady Pemberton's card party, and by then, Ophelia had grown almost accustomed to the strange new rhythm of her life. London had not forgotten the scandal, exactly, but the nature of its interest had shifted considerably. Curiosity replacing cruelty, quiet respect slowly overtaking the old whispers of madness that had followed her for 7 long years. Edgar Croft had vanished from society almost entirely in the weeks following his public humiliation. rumors suggesting he had retreated to some distant relation's estate in the countryside, his reputation too damaged to withstand continued exposure among the very circles he had once hoped to exploit for advancement. Ophelia felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only relief that his threat, at least, had finally been extinguished. Her relationship with Cassius had continued its slow, careful mending in the weeks since, old wounds beginning to close beneath the deliberate effort both siblings now made to speak honestly with one another, rather than retreating into the guarded silence that had defined so much of their relationship since Margaret's death. It was not a perfect healing, not yet, but it was progress neither of them had believed possible only months earlier. And Julian had remained a steady, constant presence throughout the weeks following her confession, calling on her regularly, walking with her through gardens and along quiet London streets, their conversations deepening with each meeting into something Ophelia had never expected to find again after 7 years of careful isolation. She found herself, increasingly, unable to imagine her life without his steady presence woven through it. Tonight, dressed in deep blue silk that Beatrice had insisted complemented her eyes perfectly, Ophelia arrived at Ravenscourt House for the summer ball, with a confidence she had not felt walking through those doors in longer than she could remember. The same ballroom where she had once slipped away into darkness, desperate to avoid the weight of London's judgment, now welcomed her with genuine warmth from guests who greeted her not with pity or suspicion, but with something closer to respect. Julian found her within minutes of her arrival, his expression brightening the moment their eyes met across the crowded room. He crossed to her side immediately, offering a bow that carried far more warmth than formal courtesy required. "You look radiant," he said quietly, offering his arm, "though I confess I find myself rather biased where you are concerned." "A dangerous quality in a duke," Ophelia said, accepting his arm with an ease that would have seemed impossible only months before. "I hope your other guests do not suffer for your distraction tonight." "Let them suffer," Julian said, a teasing smile playing at his lips. "I find I have grown rather selfish these past weeks, regarding how I choose to spend my attention." Earlier in the evening, before Julian had found her, Ophelia had spent a quiet moment near the refreshment table with the Dowager Duchess, who had taken to seeking her out at every gathering with a warmth that still occasionally caught Ophelia by surprise. "You seem different tonight," the Duchess observed, studying her with the same sharp assessment she always brought to any conversation. "Lighter, perhaps." "I feel different," Ophelia admitted. "For 7 years, every ball felt like a performance I had to survive. Tonight feels like something I actually wish to be part of." "That is precisely what happens," the Duchess said, "when a person finally stops carrying a burden alone. I have watched my son change these past months as well, though I doubt he realizes how visible it is to the rest of us. He has always been careful, methodical, slow to trust. Whatever passed between the two of you these past weeks, it has done wonders for both your dispositions." Ophelia had smiled at that, unable to fully articulate how thoroughly her life had shifted since that first midnight conversation in the garden, how the careful architecture of fear and isolation she had constructed around herself for 7 years had, piece by piece, begun to fall away in Julian's steady, patient company. Nearby, Cassius had stood in quiet conversation with Beatrice, watching his sister across the crowded room with an expression that mixed pride with something gentler, something that had been largely absent from his face throughout the years of careful vigilance following Margaret's death. Beatrice had noticed it too, nudging him lightly with her elbow. "She looks happy," Beatrice said. "Truly happy, I mean. Not the careful performance of happiness she used to manage for our benefit." "I know," Cassius said quietly. "I only wish I had understood sooner how much that performance was costing her." "You understand now," Beatrice said. "That counts for something." When Julian finally located Ophelia near the refreshment table, drawing her toward the dance floor with an eagerness he made no attempt to hide, the earlier conversations faded into pleasant background as the music swelled around them. They danced together twice within the first hour, drawing curious glances from around the room, though the whispers that followed now carried none of the old cruelty. If anything, London seemed thoroughly charmed by the unfolding courtship between the reclusive Duke and the young woman who had so recently, so bravely, reclaimed her own story before all of society. It was nearing midnight when Julian led her away from the crowded dance floor, guiding her instead toward the same terrace doors that opened onto the garden where they had first spoken all those months ago. The night air felt cool and welcoming after the warmth of the crowded ballroom, stars scattered thickly overhead in a clear summer sky. "Do you remember," Julian said, once they had reached the quiet privacy of the garden path, "the first night we met here? You told me the rumors about you were dangerous to believe." I remember, Ophelia said softly. You told me you preferred to judge things for yourself, rather than trusting gossip. I have never been more grateful for a personal principle in my entire life, Julian said. He stopped walking, turning to face her fully beneath the same elm trees where their first conversation had unfolded, moonlight filtering gently through the branches overhead. Ophelia, these past months have changed something in me I did not expect to find changed. I came to London prepared to fulfill my duties, attend the necessary events, eventually make some sensible match that satisfied society's expectations. I did not expect to find someone who challenged every assumption I carried about courage, about honesty, about what it truly means to love someone fully, including every difficult part of their history. Ophelia's breath caught, her heart racing as she watched him lower himself slowly to one knee before her, right there in the moonlit garden, in full view of anyone who might glance out from the ballroom windows behind them. Julian, she whispered, her hand rising instinctively to her chest. I do not care who sees this, Julian said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability evident in his expression. I have spent my entire life avoiding public spectacle, preferring the quiet certainty of careful decisions made away from prying eyes. But you taught me something these past months, Ophelia. You taught me that the truest things in life are worth declaring openly, whatever the cost of doing so. I love you, not despite everything you have survived, but because of the remarkable strength and honesty with which you have survived it. I am asking you, before all of London if they care to watch, to marry me. Behind them, Ophelia became distantly aware of movement near the terrace doors, guests drawn by curiosity toward the unfolding scene in the garden below. She did not turn to look, her entire attention remained fixed on Julian's face, on the steady sincerity in his eyes, on the promise of a future she had never dared imagine for herself throughout 7 long years of careful isolation. 7 years ago, she said softly, tears gathering freely now, unguarded for the first time in longer than she could remember. I believed I would spend the rest of my life alone, carrying a secret that made genuine happiness impossible. You did not simply help me reclaim my story, Julian. You helped me believe I deserved a future beyond survival. Is that a yes? Julian asked, a hopeful smile breaking through his careful composure. That is most certainly a yes, Ophelia said, laughing through her tears as Julian rose to his feet and gathered her into his arms, the small crowd that had gathered at the terrace doors erupting into soft applause and delighted murmurs behind them. Cassius, who had followed the commotion outside alongside Beatrice, felt tears prick unexpectedly at his own eyes, as he watched his sister embraced fully, publicly, joyfully, by a man who had proven himself worthy of her trust in every way that mattered. 7 years of guilt eased somewhat in that moment, watching Ophelia finally claim the happiness he had, in his fear and grief, so nearly cost her entirely. The Dowager Duchess appeared at the terrace doors moments later, her expression carrying open delight as she took in the scene before her. Well, she said, her voice carrying clearly enough for those nearby to hear, it appears my son has finally done something sensible with his considerable stubbornness. Laughter rippled through the gathered crowd, and Ophelia found herself laughing along with them, genuine and unrestrained, the sound of it foreign and wonderful after 7 years spent carefully guarding every expression of true feeling. Word of the engagement spread through the ballroom within minutes, and by the time Julian escorted Ophelia back inside, the entire gathering had transformed into something resembling a celebration far beyond the ball's original purpose. Guests approached with genuine warmth, offering congratulations that carried none of the calculated distance Ophelia had grown accustomed to receiving over 7 isolated years. Beatrice embraced her fiercely amid the celebration, tears streaming freely down her face. I always knew, she whispered. From the very first moment you mentioned meeting a duke in the garden, I knew something remarkable was beginning. You knew nothing of the sort, Ophelia said, laughing. You simply enjoyed teasing me about it. Perhaps a little of both, Beatrice admitted, grinning through her tears. Though I will say, watching you tonight, I hardly recognize the woman who used to vanish from every ballroom within the first half hour. You used to tell me you preferred the shadows, because the shadows never judged you. I am glad you finally found somewhere brighter to stand. I had a great deal of help finding my way there, Ophelia said, glancing toward Julian, who stood a short distance away accepting congratulations from a cluster of well-wishers with visible good humor. Do not give him all the credit, Beatrice said, squeezing her hand. You are the one who walked into that ballroom tonight and stood beside him without flinching, in front of everyone who once whispered about you. That courage was entirely your own. A cluster of older matrons approached shortly afterward, women who had, only months earlier, been among the loudest voices spreading rumors about Ophelia's supposed instability. Their congratulations now carried a note of careful contrition, an unspoken acknowledgement of judgment too readily given without proper understanding. Ophelia accepted their well wishes graciously, choosing generosity over the resentment she might once have felt entitled to hold. "It is remarkable," one of the women remarked quietly to her companion as they moved away, "how wrong we all were about that girl." "Yes," her companion agreed. "Though I suppose it is never too late to admit such things properly." Ophelia, catching fragments of the exchange, felt no particular satisfaction in the belated recognition, only a quiet, settled peace at having finally moved beyond needing anyone else's validation to know her own worth. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Julian drew Ophelia aside once more, finding a quieter corner near the terrace where they could speak without the press of well-wishers surrounding them constantly. "I meant every word," he said quietly, taking her hands in his. "This is only the beginning, Ophelia. Whatever challenges remain, whatever whispers occasionally persist, despite everything, I intend to stand beside you through all of it, exactly as I promised in the library that rainy afternoon." "I believe you," Ophelia said, and she meant it completely. 7 years of hard-won caution finally giving way to genuine, unguarded trust. "For the first time in longer than I can remember, I believe entirely in the future ahead of me." Outside, beyond the tall windows of Ravenscourt House, the summer night stretched clear and endless above London. Stars scattered brightly across a sky finally free of the storm clouds that had gathered so persistently throughout the difficult months before. Inside, surrounded by genuine warmth rather than careful judgment, Lady Ophelia Wren stood transformed, no longer the woman London had called mad for 7 long years, but someone entirely her own, finally free to claim the happiness she had fought so bravely, and at such great cost, to earn. The scandal that had once defined her had, at last, become simply a chapter in a much larger story, one she now stood ready to continue writing on her own terms, with a man beside her who had never once asked her to hide any part of who she truly was. Near the close of the evening, as guests began gradually taking their leave and the musicians eased into softer, quieter melodies, Ophelia found herself standing once more near the terrace doors, looking out over the same garden where everything between them had first begun. Julian joined her there, wrapping a light shawl around her shoulders against the cooling night air, his hand lingering warmly at her back. "What are you thinking?" he asked, following her gaze out toward the moonlit hedges. "I am thinking about how strange it is," Ophelia said, "that the place I once used to hide from London's judgment has become the place where I found the courage to stop hiding altogether." "Gardens have a way of holding both kinds of memories," Julian said thoughtfully. "The ones we retreat into, and the ones we grow forward from." Ophelia turned to look at him fully, studying the quiet warmth in his expression, still faintly astonished that a man capable of such steady, unwavering kindness had chosen, out of every woman in London, to stand beside her through the hardest reckoning of her life. "Thank you," she said softly, "for seeing me clearly, when everyone else had already decided who I was." "You made that easier than you realize," Julian said. "You simply needed someone willing to actually look." Cassius approached them a short while later, offering his sister a rare, genuine smile before extending his hand toward Julian. "Welcome to the family, Your Grace," he said, "though I suspect, given how thoroughly you have already won my sister's trust, my approval matters rather less than it once might have." "Your approval matters a great deal to me," Julian said, shaking his hand firmly. "I intend to prove myself a worthy addition to your family, Cassius, in whatever ways I am able." "You have already proven that," Cassius said, glancing toward Ophelia with unmistakable affection. "More than adequately." As the final guests departed and the great house began settling into quiet, Ophelia lingered a while longer in the garden with Julian, unwilling yet to let the evening fully end. Above them, the summer stars continued their slow wheel across the London sky, indifferent witnesses to 7 years of carefully guarded grief, finally giving way to something Ophelia had once believed entirely beyond her reach. She thought, briefly, of Margaret, of the sister whose memory had shaped so much of her difficult journey these past 7 years. She hoped, standing there beneath the same elm trees where her own story had quietly begun to change, that Margaret would have been glad to see her finally unburdened, finally free, finally loved exactly as she was, without condition or careful concealment. "Ready to go back inside?" Julian asked gently, noticing the distant look that had settled briefly over her features. "Not quite yet," Ophelia said, leaning into the warmth of his side as he wrapped an arm securely around her shoulders. "I think I would like to stay here a little longer. This garden has given me a great deal to be grateful for." They remained there together, beneath the quiet stars, London's grand houses glowing softly in the distance, the difficult chapter of Ophelia's past finally settling into something she could carry with peace rather than fear, and the promising future ahead of her, stretching out as wide and welcoming as the summer sky above. 2 years had passed since the summer night Julian knelt before her in the garden at Ravenscourt House, and Ophelia sometimes found it difficult to believe how thoroughly her life had transformed in that time, how distant the careful isolation of her earlier years now felt from the warmth she woke to each morning. The wedding itself had taken place the following spring, a smaller, more intimate affair than London's grandest families typically favored, held in the same gardens where their story had first begun. Ophelia had insisted on this, wanting the place that had witnessed her quiet transformation to also witness her joy, and Julian had agreed without hesitation, understanding instinctively why the setting mattered so deeply to her. Cassius had walked her down the aisle that day, tears openly visible in his eyes despite his usual careful composure, and the memory of his expression as he placed her hand in Julian's remained one of Ophelia's most treasured memories, a final, complete healing of the fractured trust that had once defined their relationship following Margaret's death. The Dowager Duchess had wept as well, though she would later deny it firmly to anyone who dared mention it, insisting instead that the summer pollen had simply been unusually troublesome that particular afternoon. Beatrice had served as Ophelia's attendant, delivering a toast during the wedding breakfast so thoroughly embarrassing and affectionate that Ophelia had laughed until tears streamed down her own face, grateful beyond words for a friendship that had remained steady throughout every difficult year that preceded her happiness. Now, settled into married life at Ravenscourt House, Ophelia found herself waking each morning to a peace she had once believed permanently beyond her reach. The house that had once seemed so imposing during that first midnight garden conversation had gradually become simply home, filled with warmth rather than the careful formality she had initially expected from ducal life. Her relationship with Cassius had continued strengthening in the 2 years since her wedding. The careful distance that once defined their interactions replaced by genuine closeness neither had believed possible during the darkest years following Margaret's death. Cassius visited regularly, and Ophelia had come to treasure these visits deeply, watching her brother slowly release the guilt he had carried for so long, finding his own quiet happiness eventually in a match with a thoughtful widow named Charlotte, whom he had met at one of Ophelia's own dinner parties the previous autumn. Edgar Croft, Ophelia occasionally heard through distant gossip, had never fully recovered his standing in London society, his attempts at manipulation having permanently damaged the reputation he had once guarded so carefully. She felt, when his name occasionally arose in conversation, only distant indifference now, the power he once held over her life having long since evaporated entirely. This particular morning, Ophelia sat in the same library where she had once spent countless solitary hours during her unmarried years, though the room now felt considerably different, filled with the comfortable clutter of a life shared rather than a solitude carefully maintained. Julian entered quietly, settling into the chair across from her with the easy familiarity of 2 years spent building a life together. "You are thinking about Margaret again," he said gently, recognizing the particular quality of stillness that always accompanied such memories. "I am," Ophelia admitted, setting aside the book she had not truly been reading. "It has been 9 years now since the fire. I still think of her often, though the grief feels different now, softer, somehow, less like drowning and more like simply missing someone I loved dearly." "I imagine she would be glad," Julian said, "to see how far you have come, to see you finally living the kind of full, honest life she once wanted so desperately for herself." "I like to think so," Ophelia said. "I visit her grave more often now than I used to. It no longer feels like visiting a source of shame I must carry quietly. It feels like visiting someone I loved, which is exactly what it always should have felt like." Julian reached across the small distance between their chairs, taking her hand gently in his own. "You gave her memory the honesty it always deserved," he said. "That is no small gift, Ophelia, however long it took you to finally offer it." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the late morning sunlight filtering warmly through the library windows, before the sound of quick footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of their daughter, a bright, curious 2-year-old named Margaret Rose, who toddled into the room with the particular fearless enthusiasm of a child who had never known a single moment of the careful restriction that had once shaped her mother's own childhood. "Mama," the little girl announced, climbing determinedly onto Ophelia's lap with the confident assumption of a child certain of her welcome. "Story." "Which story would you like, little one?" Ophelia asked, smoothing back the girl's dark curls with practiced affection. "Garden story," Margaret Rose said decisively, a request she made often enough that Ophelia had long since committed a gentle, age-appropriate version of it to memory, one that spoke of a lady who once felt very alone, and a kind man, who found her in a moonlit garden, and helped her discover that she was never truly alone at all. As Ophelia began the familiar tale, Julian settled comfortably beside them, occasionally adding his own embellishments to the story, much to their daughter's evident delight. Watching her husband entertain their child with exaggerated impressions of the very garden conversation that had once changed both their lives so completely, Ophelia felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it nearly stole her breath entirely. She thought sometimes, in quiet moments like this one, of the frightened, isolated woman she had been only a few years earlier, certain that happiness of this magnitude would remain forever beyond her reach, convinced that the truth of her past made her fundamentally unworthy of genuine love. That woman felt like a distant memory now, someone she remembered with compassion rather than shame, understanding at last how thoroughly circumstance and grief, rather than any true flaw in her character, had shaped those difficult years. Later that afternoon, as Margaret Rose napped upstairs under the watchful care of her nurse, Ophelia walked alone through the same garden where her story had first begun, pausing beneath the familiar elm trees that had witnessed so much of her transformation. The hedges had grown slightly wilder in the years since, the roses climbing more freely along the old stone walls, though the essential character of the place remained unchanged, quiet and private, and somehow always ready to offer exactly the peace she needed. Julian found her there, as he often did during these solitary garden walks, understanding without needing to ask that she occasionally required these quiet moments of reflection amid the full, busy happiness of their shared life. He did not interrupt immediately, simply standing nearby, watching her with the same steady patience that had first drawn her to him years earlier. "I was just thinking," Ophelia said, finally turning to face him, "about how strange it is that the worst night of my life, in some ways, led me directly to the best. Not the fire itself, but everything that followed, the isolation, the silence. If I had never carried that burden for 7 years, I might never have been standing in this exact garden the night we met. I do not believe suffering exists simply to produce good outcomes," Julian said thoughtfully, moving to stand beside her. "I think more simply that you survived something unbearably difficult with remarkable grace, and that grace eventually led you toward a life you deserved all along, regardless of the painful path required to reach it." "Perhaps," Ophelia said, leaning into his side as his arms settled naturally around her shoulders. "Either way, I am grateful for exactly where that path has led." They stood together beneath the elm trees, as the afternoon light softened gradually toward evening, two people whose story had begun in whispered rumor and careful isolation, now standing firmly in a happiness neither had once believed themselves capable of claiming. Behind them, Ravenscourt house glowed warmly in the fading light, home now in every sense that mattered, filled with laughter and honesty and the particular peace that comes only after truth has finally been allowed to triumph over fear. That evening, after Margaret Rose had been settled properly for the night, Ophelia and Julian dined quietly together on the terrace overlooking the garden, the same view that had accompanied so many of the important conversations that shaped their life together. Cassius had sent word earlier in the week that he intended to visit the following month, bringing Charlotte along to discuss wedding plans of their own, a prospect that filled Ophelia with genuine delight rather than the old anxious vigilance she once might have felt regarding any gathering that drew London's attention toward her family. "Your brother seems happier than I have ever seen him," Julian observed, pouring wine for them both as the last light faded from the sky. "He is," Ophelia agreed. "I believe Charlotte has helped him finally release some of the guilt he carried for so long. It is good to see him building something new, rather than simply managing the damage of the past. Family healing seems to run in generous supply this year," Julian said with a smile. "Perhaps happiness simply becomes easier to recognize," Ophelia said, "once you have finally stopped expecting only difficulty." They spoke for a while longer of small, ordinary things, plans for the coming autumn, a letter recently received from Beatrice detailing her own budding courtship with a scholar she had met at a lecture series, the modest improvements Julian intended for the eastern wing of the house. There was a particular comfort in such ordinary conversation, Ophelia had come to realize, a comfort she had once believed herself permanently barred from experiencing, back when every conversation felt weighted with careful calculation and hidden danger. As the evening deepened into full darkness, stars gradually emerging above the quiet garden, Ophelia found her thoughts returning once more, gently now rather than painfully, to the sister whose memory had shaped so much of her difficult journey. She hoped, as she often did in such quiet moments, That Margaret somehow knew her story had not ended in tragedy after all. That the sister who had once sacrificed so much silence on her behalf had finally found her way toward a life worth living fully, openly, without fear. "Ready to go inside?" Julian asked eventually, noticing the peaceful stillness that had settled over her. "In a moment," Ophelia said, reaching for his hand across the small table between them. "I find I rather like sitting here with you, watching the stars settle over everything that used to frighten me. It reminds me how far we have both come. We have quite a lot of years ahead of us yet," Julian said softly, "to continue proving exactly how far that journey can still go." Ophelia smiled, watching the last traces of twilight fade completely into the deep, star-filled dark above Ravenscourt House. Whatever challenges the years ahead might still bring, she faced them now not with the careful, guarded fear that had once defined her existence, but with the quiet, steady confidence of a woman who had finally, fully, reclaimed her own story, and found it, in the end, far more beautiful than anyone had ever believed possible. London still remembered, occasionally, the scandal that had once defined Lady Ophelia Wren, though the story had softened considerably with time, transformed gradually from cautionary tale into something closer to legend, the story of a woman who had endured 7 years of unjust judgment before finally reclaiming her own truth, and finding, against every expectation, a love steady enough to hold that truth alongside her for the rest of her days.